welcome. Hopefully that helps set a little bit of the mood for what we'll start out talking about. We're going to be looking at what I like to call the curse of the testing pyramid. But first, let's start looking at some curses from ancient Egypt. So that's where we're going to start, and then we will get to Agile stuff. So um, back when they were excavating tombs in Egypt and stuff, there was this story. I think this was 1922 in the New York Times. And Howard Carter was the archaeologist, and he was being funded by the Carnivar. Carnivar. I'm saying their name wrong. We'll see in a second. Um, Family was funding him, and Carter had brought along a canary because he got lonely just being stuck out there by himself all the time. And the day after they opened the tomb, there was a party, people at his house, and they heard this commotion, and they went out, and there was a snake that was starting to get into the canary cage, and they think it killed the canary by frightening it so much. But it was the same snake that they had found on the outside of the tomb, like carvings of the snake on the outside of the tomb. And so it says here that the incident made an impression on the native staff, who regarded it as a warning from the spirit of the departed kings against further intrusion on the privacy of his tomb. So here's a picture of before they excavated the tomb, and this is, let's see, right here. So the guy with the cane is Lord Carn. I'm just going to say it right, Carnarvon. Yeah, Carnarvon, and that's his daughter next to him. And then there's Howard Carter. Now, what I want to point out here is, of these three people, this person is now deceased. Howard Carter has died. The daughter has died, and Lord Carnarvon had died as well. Remember, he died fairly recently, fairly close to the time after they had opened the tomb. So here's Lord Carnarvon, and the way that he died is he got a mosquito bite on his face, and then he was shaving and he cut it, and it got infected and led to blood poisoning, and then he died. And the people that were looking at things in the tomb discovered that he had a cut on his cheek and died from it. Tutankhamun's mummy had a cut on his cheek as well, so they're thinking that's probably not a coincidence. Here's where he's buried, back in, let's see, where he's in the UK, England, can't remember exactly, but you may not recognize his grave, but you might recognize his house. This is where he lived. Does that look familiar to anyone? It's Highclere Castle. Yes, yes, it was used for the Downton Abbey TV series and movie, I think. Anyway, if you look up kind of the history of this, one of Lord Carnarvon's descendants still lives there, and in the basement they have quite an exhibit of Egyptian artifacts and things. Now, so around this time, so this is like 1922, the author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, so of Sherlock Holmes fame, he attributed Lord Carnarvon's death to the elementals protecting the tomb. And that's why he said they died. You know, they didn't want to know whatever these elementals were. He also was a very big fan and believer in the Cottingley fairies, which was these girls said they had seen some fairies, and somebody showed up and gave them a camera, and they started producing these pictures of them talking to fairies, which later they said was a hoax, and these were just cutouts from magazines. But one girl still maintained that they had seen a fairy, but they hadn't taken a picture of it. So it's another thing Doyle was very into. Another thing kind of happening around that time, Sir Bruce Ingram, he was a publisher, and Carter, the archaeologist, gave him a mummified hand paperweight. Now, that sounds more like an insult to me, but I guess that was a cool thing to do. Anyway, he gave this to him, and on the inscription on this, the tomb that it came from, it said, "Cursed be he who moves my body. To him shall come fire, water, and pestilence." Well, soon after getting that paperweight, or the mummified hand, Ingram's house burned down. So we got the fire, and so he rebuilt it, and soon after that, it flooded. So he rebuilt it again, and by that time he decided maybe I shouldn't keep this mummified hand, and he got rid of it before finding out what pestilence would look like, I guess. Now, when Benito Mussolini heard about what was happening, heard about this curse and about Carter's death and stuff, he had been gifted mummies from Egypt, and so he removed them from his palace after hearing about the curse of the pharaohs and the death of Lord Carnarvon. And what strikes me as just kind of funny about this is like, oh, here, let me give you a gift. Here's somebody's hand, or here's a mummy. It just seems kind of odd, but that's where things were at. Okay, so with that kind of background, based on what we've said so far, what do you think about the idea of there being a curse? There definitely was a curse on that tomb. Here, let me add the link back here in case you got it. And I keep this up because so you'll want to make sure you're participating in the polls and stuff, because when we get to the end, we are actually going to be giving away something we've never given away before. We're going to be giving away a box of Count Chocula, which seemed appropriate for the subject matter. There's a mummy cereal too, but I couldn't find that. So Count Chocula will be if you're in the U.S. If you're outside the U.S., I'll see what I can do. But okay, so make sure you click on that link and bring this up, or you can go to that URL up there. Okay, so based on what we've seen so far, what do you think about the idea of being the curse? Okay, so far, no one says that there's a curse. B, there probably wasn't a curse, but people believed it, so they tended to die sooner based on their expectations. C, no curse. People just paid attention to bad things to reinforce the idea of the curse. Or D, I'm not saying it was aliens were involved, but it was definitely aliens involved. So none of us here think that there was actually a curse on it. And statistically speaking, people associated with opening the tomb didn't die early. As somebody pointed out, these people from 1922, these people would all be, if they had been born on that day, they would be 102 years old. So, like, we should expect them to be dead anyway. But anyway, the thing what was driving the idea, and this does relate to Agile and testing, but what was driving the idea of the curse? Well, back when they were getting ready to open the tomb, one of the things that they were doing is they were selling the rights to the story to the New York Times. So they needed to keep people out and away from the tomb because they wanted to make sure the exclusive rights were for the New York Times. So they told everybody that there was a curse on the tomb. It turned out that this particular tomb, Tutankhamun's tomb, if I understand correctly, didn't actually have a curse on it. It was like one of the ones that didn't. But they told the story because it would help keep people away from it, people being scared of the curse. And that's what I want us to kind of take away from this, is that stories will influence behavior. And sometimes we forget to ask if they are actually true. So let's talk testing. With that in mind, let's talk about testing. So question for you, when it comes to testing, what does your team discuss the most? Do you discuss the testing pyramid, the return on investment the tests are providing to the customer, complaining about how long the tests take, or complain that the tests are broken yet again? And yes, Stephanie, confirmation bias, I think, is a big part of what was leading to the idea of the curse. If you're looking for it, you can find ways to make the information fit what you're trying to see. And I think a lot of people really like the idea of there being a curse on them, that because it makes it more exciting than just, oh yes, there was a tomb when we opened it. Okay, so this is saying that the team, it looks like we don't have anybody here talking about the testing pyramid. I'm guessing that, or it was being the main thing. We've got 10%. They're actually talking about the return on investments that they're providing customers. Last time I did that talk, that number was a lot smaller. So that's cool to see. Number C, complaining how long the tests take, or D, complaining that the tests are broken again. That's definitely a big area for with a lot of teams that I've worked on. When B gets significantly high, though, when the team really starts feeling the return on investments that there's a huge return on investment the tests are providing to the customer, I find that these things don't tend to be as big of issue, or the teams work on trying to find ways to make them faster. Okay, so if the focus isn't on the value or return on investment, then there are probably ways to improve your testing strategy. If that's not what's really being discussed, it might be a good canary, we'll use that, a good canary to point out that there may be something that you can improve in your testing strategy. So let's look at a kind of a brief history of testing, just kind of an overview of how software testing has evolved. So we used to kind of see a stage where you'd go in and you'd start out with, they start with the requirements. This would very much be kind of a waterfall, but Agile kind of does this as well. Requirements, and then you do development, and then there's manual testing that happens at the end of stuff. So people discovered that there was a lot of time spent waiting for manual testing. I was working on one team that we were replacing a piece of software, and the old piece of software, because it was very, very important, it was actually for the Treasury Department, it had to be tested very thoroughly before they deployed it again. Well, their test took, I believe took 6 people 12 weeks to fully test everything. If you have to wait for every change for 6 people to do 12 weeks worth of work, there's a lot of waiting for that manual testing process. So waiting for manual testing takes a very, very long time. So the thought was, let's use tools to automate this, right? Let's find a way to make this go faster by using automation. So what happened is a lot of places started splitting into the manual testing and automated testing. And that would be something like UI recordings. HP Test Center has a way to do recordings. The Mercury, which I think became HP Test Center, had a way of doing that. Selenium has a way that you can actually record your clicks on the screen and then play them back. So different ways of automating the testing by saying, what is the manual tester going to do? What are they going to click on the screen? Have them do that once, and then it'll be automated. We can just run it again and again. And of course, everyone lived happily ever after, right? This describes the nirvana that you're experiencing. This solved all problems, correct? Is that thumbs up? Anybody thumbs up or maybe a thumbs down? That's not what you're getting. Okay, well, I've got an LOL. Okay, so maybe everyone didn't live happily ever after, but let's see. So what best describes your experience with recording UI interactions and then playing them back to test the software? So A would be people actually do that. Maybe that's a new idea. B, it works great. C, it's useful as long as there are few enough to make it easy to maintain. D, kind of useful, but they break and take a long time to fix. Or E, they usually end up breaking and no one fixes them, so they get turned off. So fill that out. And like I said, remember to keep that up because I'm sure everyone here is really excited about winning a box of Count Chocula. Oh, I'm saying it wrong. Cereal. Okay, so let's see. Okay, no one's in the category of saying this just works absolutely great. We've got 20% like didn't even know you could do that, which probably is an indication it doesn't work super well. We got 31% saying, it can be useful if there's not very many of them. If there's few enough to make it easy to maintain. 27% saying it's kind of useful, but they break, take a long time to fix. And then 23% saying they break and then no one fixes them. Which, if you've got something that no one's willing to invest their time in and fixing, it probably means it's not all that valuable because no one's willing to invest time in it. Or it could be structural issues. Okay, so everyone lived happy ever after, except that they didn't, right? So what happened is, we're instead of going from waiting for people to do the test, we're now waiting for people to update the test because this happens at the end of the process. So we're in a situation here where it's slow to run, hard to tie a failed test back to the change, and the UI tests are very, very brittle. So if we ask ourselves, well, what might be fast to run, easy to tie a failed test back to the change, and not brittle, easy to refactor and stuff, there was something else happening around this time called, meanwhile, test-driven development, and that started becoming part of the development process. And test-driven development, where you're creating unit tests, are, at least compared to the manual test or the automated test that we were discussing back there, are generally fast to run. They're easy to tie a failed test back to the change because they're run very, very quickly and right related to when the change is made. And they're not as brittle. It's easier to refactor unit level tests because you can actually use refactoring tools for them as opposed to a screen recording. Now, TDD doesn't test user experience necessarily, but it is something that can be helpful. It can be very helpful. So we've gone to TDD where we've got fast to run, easy to tie back to a change, not brittle. We've used that to replace the test, or that's what we're experiencing with TDD and unit level test, as opposed to the UI tests that are slow to run, hard to tie a failed test back to the change, and the UI tests are very, very brittle. So the testing pyramid comes from the idea of saying, hey, I've got an idea. Let's do more of this, the fast to run, easy to tie a failed test back to the change, not brittle, and less of this other thing that's very painful. So that gives us this, right? Where we've got this idea of different levels of testing. Let's do a bunch of unit level testing, some integration tests, and few user interface tests. So user interface tests would be something that the user actually touches and sees. It interacts as if the user's interacting with it. It's usually created, in a lot of organizations, it's created by a testing team. I would argue that's not the most efficient place to create it, but a lot of times that's what's happening. It replicates the manual testing. It's brittle, hard to refactor, and often can be very, very slow to run. Integration tests, kind of that middle layer, test the way that the different pieces of the software hook together. Oftentimes it doesn't touch the UI. Matter of fact, most times when people are thinking of integration tests, they aren't touching the UI. It doesn't always use the user's point of view. If you're testing a controller and how it works with a service, it may be something that the user can kind of trigger, but you're probably not thinking of testing it from the standpoint of a user interacting with something because we're not working with the UI. It's usually easier to refactor than the UI tests and often runs moderately quickly. You're not having to wait for a web page to render, but you may be having to wait for something to go over a network or interact with the database. Then the unit level tests are small tests, method level tests, testing individual methods, never touches the UI. It doesn't integrate the parts because you're just testing the individual units, and usually runs very, very quickly. Oftentimes this doesn't require having a database or any network connection. It's just very, very fast because you're just testing the individual methods. So this is something that can run in a matter of seconds. So you've got user interface tests that in some places might be something that's measured in hours. Integration tests, maybe they're measured in minutes, and unit tests that maybe are measured in seconds, roughly. Okay, so that's what kind of got to the idea of this testing pyramid. But then we got new tools, and we discovered new patterns, and we got access to the cloud. So which question seems most useful in deciding whether or not you should create a test? Should it be what shape is made if I were to represent my test with Lego blocks? Or what return on investment would I get from this test? Wait just a minute to see if anybody's like really into Legos here. So the point being here that we probably want to be thinking more about the return on investment. And if we're dealing with, so what we were discussing there is here's how the pyramid came about. If we have new tools, new approaches, we probably want to be careful that we're not stuck in an old paradigm and thinking in terms of a pyramid if that may not make sense today. And we'll look at some of the reasons it might be a little bit different. So that leads us to the curse of the testing pyramid. So let's look at some of the curses that may come from the testing pyramid if we look back at how we got to the idea of there needing to be a pyramid of small number of UI tests, medium number of integration tests, and a large number of unit tests. Curse number one, trying to create a shape instead of creating value. So what type of return on investment do I get from each test versus asking what shape is made if I were to represent my test with Lego blocks? So let's look at another shape. So here's a common shape. And what I want to present here is the idea that saying that something may be shaped in a certain shape and trying to create that shape does not mean that you should necessarily try to create that shape. So here is a distribution of IQs in the world, particularly in the US. But so it creates a bell curve for is how the IQs are represented. So this is very interesting, and there's lots of things we can get out of this in thinking of maybe how many people in a pool of people will be at different intelligence levels and things like that. But what we should not do with this is, could you imagine teachers in a classroom going, you know what, we've got, you know, in this top part of it, the people above 100 IQ, that doesn't represent 50% in our class. We've actually got 60% of our kids are above the 100% IQ. So what we need to do is try to find some way to dumb them down to make sure we've got the 50% split right here. Or we've got too many people that are up here, so we need to find some way to make them not as smart so we can get this shape. And that sounds silly, but my point is the fact that this shape occurs naturally, or there may be reasons for the shape to occur, doesn't mean necessarily that teachers should go and change the way they're working to try to create this shape. If they're getting something that's actually better results than what that shape gives you. So what shape provides the most value for your application? Well, would it be a square, same number of tests everywhere? Is it actually a pyramid? Maybe it is. But what if it's a pear-shaped? If your tests are more pear-shaped, is that a bad thing? Well, it probably doesn't matter what the shape is. Or strawberry-shaped. The way I like to say it is, if banana-shaped tests provide greater value, then you should have banana-shaped tests. And my point being, not that you should try to create a shape with banana that looks like a banana for the number of tests you have. I don't know how you do that anyway. But the point being that if you're being driven by the return on investment of the test, the shape shouldn't matter. If they happen to stack up into a pyramid, that's great, but you may be in a different situation. You may have one project that the pyramid shape tests work very well, and that is the optimal shape of test for getting return on investment for that particular application. But you shouldn't try to create that at the expense of maybe doing things that aren't really optimal for your particular application. So curse number 2, believing what was slow in 2006 is necessarily slow today. There's lots of things back when people were talking about the testing pyramid that there were constraints that we may not necessarily have today. The pyramid base, this is Martin Fowler saying, the pyramid is based on the assumption that broad stack tests are expensive, slow, and brittle compared to more focused tests such as unit tests. So in a lot of cases, this is actually true, right? And particularly back in 2006, this was probably very, very true. Nowadays, it's not necessarily true, especially if we decide that our tests are really, really valuable and design our processes to make it to where they're less brittle and they're less slow and they're less expensive. So so think about this. If we've got 1,000 UI tests that take 2 minutes each, that means it's going to take us, 33 hours to get through all of these. Well, back in 2006, 2009, that would have been very, very slow to get through all those. You're waiting 33 hours for all these tests to get through, and only 1,000 tests that are doing things with the UI. But what if this were really, really valuable? Well, now we could easily spin up 4 servers, just on demand, spin up 4 servers with 20 containers each and get through 1,000 UI tests that takes 2 minutes each in 25 minutes and just pay for the time that we used it and then shut it back down again. The point is that this might have been really, really slow a long time ago, but we have technology available to us today that could make this make this go very, very rapidly. And if we can get everything else to where it's part of our processes and automate some of this, that 25 minutes to get the confidence that those 1,000 tests are passing correctly may be really, really valuable to the project, even if 33 hours would take way too long. Let's see. What is the shape? I'm going to look a few questions here. What is the shape of risk base? A pair of dice, maybe. That might be something. And then Jeff asked, what tests confirm the quality of the code? So that could be a whole talk in and of itself. The quality of the code, in my perspective, I've been on projects where we spent a lot of time analyzing the code to see if it was good quality. Some of those things were interesting, and I think the biggest value of that was to see things in our code, get together as a team, decide if it was better to do it the way the quality was suggesting, and then make those changes so we learn something new, and as we write code, we become better developers. But I would suggest the real thing that determines the quality of your code is, does it do what the customer says within the amount of time that the customer says, and can you easily change it? Those are the things that to me really represent whether the quality of the code is there. Because if you've got something that's really kind of a mess and the quality test would say, oh, you should have done this, you shouldn't have done it like this, but it performs just fine, it does everything the customer needs just fine, and it's easy to go in and change, I'm not as concerned about whether we can find some metric that says this isn't good code. Now, I think a lot of times the metrics do align with it being easy to change, but being easy to change and doing the right thing should be what's driving us more so than metrics that may make us do work that's not actually tied to something that's valuable to the customer. Oh, that's helpful. The cost and speed of running tests looks very different than it did in 2006, like we were showing right here. So we want to make sure it'll be a curse if we're thinking in terms of 2006 and following advice that maybe made sense in 2006, 2009, and totally overlooking the stuff that we've got today that can make some of these things work really, really well. Curse number 3, ignoring improved ways of doing development. So the pyramid was created as a response to UI tests being recorded by a team of testers after the fact. So the feedback coming back to the developer was something that was probably happening weeks later in most cases. Behavior-driven development, on the other hand, represents a fundamentally different way of doing development. So with behavior-driven development, and we haven't had a talk on this for a while, we should probably do another one, but with behavior-driven development, you're leveraging test-driven development, but in 2 loops. You've got this outer loop that's being created based on the requirements of how the user is going to interact with the application, and you've got an inner loop that's how the individual functions work. So your outer loop maybe say that given I am an admin user, when I log into the application, then I can see the admin menu. So that's very, very high level, very much what the user is going to experience. Well, then when you're trying to actually make that, you would take that, you would make it executable. It should fail if this isn't part of the application yet. And then you'd go in and say, okay, what method do I need? What's a test for a method that I need, like determining if somebody's an admin user or not? And you'd use your TDD loop until you finally finish and get that requirement working, and then you go on to the next one. So the requirements are done as executable specifications. So we're moving that to the requirements process, the actual creation or definition of the test. It's from the user's perspective, and the developers write the test back in code. So as a group, you get together and say, here's the executable specification. We're going to decide what this means for this story to be done. But then the developers are actually writing that test back in code that makes it to where it can execute against it. This is a very, very different approach. Like I said, well, let me see what we're looking at. Okay, ignoring improved ways of doing things. This is a very different approach than what people were doing in 2006, 2009. We don't want to this may change the shape of our tests. Another thing that's very different, page object patterns. So a page object pattern is something that lets us go and say, we're going to represent, and this gets kind of technical, so we won't get it here, but it's a way of abstracting out what you want to test instead of having, I guess a good example is, let's say your login asks for a username and a password, and that's the way you log in. So you've got thousands of tests that log in with a username and a password. And for some reason that changes, and now instead of a username, you're going to use an email address and some type of generated thing. You know, it's a two-factor something that's generated. Maybe it's email address, password, and a two-factor. Well, if you've got 1,000 places where your application logs in that hard-coded everything in there for how to get to the page and get to the login page and do those things, you've now got 1,000 places you need to change it. If you're using a page object pattern, you've got one method that says log into the system as an admin or log in as this particular test user. So if the application changes, you go to one place and you change it there for the entire application, which makes your test a lot less brittle, a lot easier to change. So it means that your developer is going to keep them in sync with the application a lot better. Okay, so kind of in summary, well, I hit a few more things here, but don't try to create a pyramid. Do try to enable the delivery of valuable software. Your tests might form a pyramid. So here's something I've heard a team actually say. We have too many UI tests. Let's delete some of them so our tests are shaped more like a pyramid and run faster. Like I have actually heard people say that. And this is very misguided, because if the tests are so useless that you are not getting any value from them, you should delete them because you're not getting any value from them. You shouldn't be deleting them just because it doesn't make a particular shape. So what shape are the tests on your current project? How would you describe the tests on your current project? So what test means you don't have test? A pyramid, ice cream cone, rectangle, hourglass. And one thing that happens a lot with behavior-driven development is you sometimes end up with more of an hourglass shape, because you end up with lots of stuff being tested from the standpoint of how the user interacts with it, lots of method level stuff getting tested from the way that the developers are thinking of writing the individual methods. But sometimes the integration level, you don't have as much of that just because of the way those two loops. We'll see a picture of the two loops in a minute. And what I've seen with mature teams is as their tests grow and they develop a little bit of an hourglass, sometimes they find that there's some UI tests that are taking a long time because they've got 100 things they're checking for. And they may end up saying something like, hey, this works, but let's take these tests that are in the UI and let's do 5 of them where we're hitting the UI. And then let's do the other 95 where we're actually going down the layer once we've proven the UI works. And we're going to hit all these different combinations down at more of the integration level. So that type of evolution might make your shape change from an hourglass to maybe more of a pyramid, but more likely more of a rectangle. But to get to that point where those types of things are happening, you have to have people that are seeing their tests as something that need to evolve along with the application. Okay, so it looks like most of us are, about 14% we're not using tests. 10% of us like just the banana idea. Rectangle is kind of where most of us are following in, followed, and then we've also got pyramid and ice cream cone kind of about the same amount there. Pyramid, ice cream cone, and hourglass are, we're close to tied in a second. So, like I said, there is nothing wrong with any of these shapes, but there is, well, what tests? Probably would be good to have some tests in your application. There's nothing wrong with having these shapes, but if you are deriving your application based on the shapes, not based on the best return on investment, if you're saying we've got an hourglass shape because this is how our tests have evolved in the best way to meet the user's needs and to keep our application tested quickly and where we can change it, then that's probably exactly where you need to be. If, like I said a minute ago, if banana-shaped tests provide greater value, then you should have banana-shaped tests. I mentioned behavior-driven development, enabling a new way of developing code. You may end up with more UI tests than on the pyramid. So you're thinking more in terms of how do I prove that this application does what the user wants? And if we start from the standpoint of saying we're going to drive our development by asking ourselves, how do I prove that this does what the user wants? We may end up with more tests that prove what the user wants as far as the way the user interacts with it. That's not a bad thing. Now, that doesn't mean we don't want to have unit level tests and integration tests, but just it seems like a very natural thing that if that's how we're driving our application, we may end up with more in that space. The way you test your software is the most important thing in determining how long that software will be able to evolve. And this is something I think we don't give enough credit to. Michael Feathers, I think, said his definition of legacy code is code that doesn't have tests. And when you think of that, the idea is if you don't have tests, it means you can't change something and have confidence that you didn't break something else. So for Michael Feathers, that's the point that it becomes legacy code, is when you're no longer at a place that you can change things with confidence you haven't broken things. Based on that definition, I've seen projects that are actually creating legacy code from the get-go, right? They're starting out writing legacy code instead of writing greenfield code and then turning into something else because they're not valuing the test as being the most important thing in determining how long that software will be able to evolve. Another quote from Martin Fowler, if my high-level tests are fast, reliable, and cheap to modify, then lower-level tests aren't needed. Now, this freaks a lot of people out when they read this, but what I really like about this is he's really driven by the value of the test. If he can have a high-level test that goes through the UI and it's fast, reliable, and it's easy to change, then he's saying that will actually test all the way through. The piece, though, that I find useful in lower level tests is what I like having happen is if I'm working with an application and something breaks and I get this thing back saying the user tried to do this and this broke, right? I've got a test that's testing from the standpoint of a user and this broke. And then I also have a failing unit test that says, and here's something that didn't do what the developers expected as well. I can troubleshoot stuff really, really rapidly because I've got an idea of how it's going to show up to the user. And I've also got an idea of what's behaving different than the way the developer thought about the application. But like Martin Fowler says, I think here, if you know something's broken, you can figure out what's going on. Those lower level tests can be useful for pinpointing stuff maybe faster. But then it's just a question about the cost benefit of creating them. What I like about this quote is focus on the value of the test, not just on the shape of the test. Okay, so question, what about AI testing frameworks where very few tests are written, but a tool automatically creates a test? I have not seen any projects using that got the same level of return on investment they would have gotten had they built their code using BDD. And the reason is because at least the AI stuff that I've seen generating stuff, it tends to generate tests that aren't necessarily that doesn't have as much awareness of the overall goal of the application as a developer will have. And so you can end up with stuff that tends to be a little bit more brittle and is harder to change, or you end up in a situation where you're basically getting tests that lock in the current functionality, whether it's right or wrong. So it's basically saying, I ran all the, I did all this stuff. Here's the application. We manually tested it. Works. Now I'm going to do something that if it ever deviates from the way it works today, I'll know that something broke. It's not that there's never a place for that being valuable, but that is a very different approach than my tests actually driving the the creation of what's the next piece I need to build. And one reason I feel that's using the test to drive it, particularly using behavior-driven development, is it makes me much more efficient in the way that I'm writing my code, because I'm not adding lots of unnecessary it makes me as a developer very focused on what's the next step I need to do, not what are all the things I can add to it. If you saw that email I sent out the other day about Frank trying to bury the entire chicken coop, BDD helps you stay focused on making sure that everybody's on the same page if we're just burying the dead chicken, not the entire chicken coop. I hope that story was humorous to you guys, but also hopefully had some meaning. Let's see, I see something here, another comment up here a little bit before. So somebody was commenting that TDD is not explicitly intended to catch bugs after they've been created. Yes, I agree, but I would also say that if you're doing test-driven development properly, it should drive knowing exactly what you need to build next. It also should help you if you come in and make a change somewhere else in the application, to be able to tell if you broke some other assumptions that you had when you were creating the application. So if it's just meant to drive the development of the application, you could just delete them all when you're through. And I've seen some tests that's like, this helped me get where I need to be, but I don't need this anymore because it won't give me any more insight into how the application's working. But yes, if you have the idea that TDD is just meant to catch bugs, you will probably not actually drive your development with tests. You'll try to write them on the back end instead of actually using it to drive the development. Okay, so here's the graph I wanted to show you with let me see if there's any other questions up there that I missed. And on the AI thing, if you've seen something that works really well, email it to me, because I'd like to see what it is, because it's a very rapidly changing field. I think AI stuff is really cool, but I think 5-10 years from now, 90% of the stuff that we were excited about it doing, it's not going to turn out to be useful for. I bet there's 10% that we're not even really thinking about it being useful for, that will be incredibly useful in the future. It'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. Okay, so this is so right here, this little loop over here that says TDD. That's the TDD process, right? I write a simple test, I watch it fail, I write code, the test passes, I refactor it, then I move on to the next test. So I've got that loop happening over there at the TDD level. This outer loop is actually behavior-driven development, where I start by saying, what's the story I'm trying to accomplish? And then saying, give me an example of what it would mean for this story to work correctly. So we're writing a scenario. So like the example I gave of saying, as an admin user, when I log into the system, then I see the admin menu. That would be a scenario. Well, you write that, it should fail. We make it executable, which means it's actually going to the application and looking for a menu that's not there. Well, now, by the time I do that, I've probably got the name of what the menu is. I've had to work out where it needs to appear. I mean, all those things that you have to decide, but those happen more closely with the requirements while you've got people there trying to determine what this needs to look like. Then once I get to that point and it's executable and it's failing against the application does not work for this example, then I end up in the TDD loop of imagining what's the next step I want to take, how would I prove that works, and end up in a loop there. Then eventually the TDD loop passes and the entire scenario passes, and then I go on to the next scenario. So that's what TDD loop looks like. So the curse of King Tut's tomb was just a story. There wasn't even a curse on that tomb, but the story created the curse. So ask yourself on your application, is the story of the testing pyramid creating a curse for your team? So is there a story that's been told over time about the need to have a testing pyramid and how your stuff should be shaped like this or like that? Is that story something that's in your team's mind that's actually creating a curse and making it to where you're not able to take advantage of tests the way that they could be, or not taking advantage of new technology that would let you utilize better testing processes? Okay, so that gets us, okay, good. We're doing good on time. So like I said, we are going to be giving away Count Chocula here. I hope that hopefully hopefully most of you guys have kids have actually had this before, maybe as adults too, and so they're like, this is going to be an appealing prize. So let me bring this up. Go ahead and give me feedback. We're going to do a quiz in just a second, but go ahead and give me the presentation feedback. As you're filling that out, I wanted just to set the stage for what you're going to win here. I'm going to show a Count Chocula ad, but go ahead and fill this out. These surveys are very, very helpful to me because when I go through and try to, I try to refine the talk, I look at the feedback we've gotten. So please take the time to fill that out. It makes a very big difference in my continuous improvement of trying to improve my talks. Okay, so while you're filling that out, here is Count Chocula.
Time to go down to the basement for some more hauntingly delicious Count Chocula cereal.
Don't look in the basement.
Eee, those eyes are looking at me. Think I'll get some fruity Frankenberry from the cupboard.
Don't look in the cupboard.
Oh, those eyes, they move.
Now the spooky, delicious part of your complete breakfast is even spookier.
Now Chocula's eyes really move. So did Frankenberry's.
He is looking at you, kids.
So I'm probably dating myself just a little bit here, having seen that when it probably came out originally. But yes, it's very much the 90s. It's not sponsored by Count Chocula. I should probably reach out to them and see if General Mills was interested in sponsoring these Agile discussions. What they had is on those cereal boxes, the eyes were positioned in a way that if you set them down and moved back and forth, it looked like it was looking at you. And I remember we moved into the farmhouse that my great-grandmother had been living in, and up in my parents' bedroom, there was a drawing on the wall of the person that had built the house, or somebody that helped build the house. I should try to find this, but anyway, the eyes would follow you, move you around like that as you were walking. And I remember as kids sneaking into the room on one side of the bed, and it was looking at us, and then we sneak around to the other side, and it's looking at us there. It was very, very creepy. So, yes, Dustin, it may be a little bit longer. We may be older than you realize. Okay, so please go ahead and fill that out. I will give it just a few more seconds. Oh, while you're filling those out. And we've got like, I don't know, 60, 70 people on here. It looks like we've only got 20 people filling this out. So let me put the link here, because please, please, please do take the time to do this. And this also makes sure that you're all set up and running for winning the cereal. So please fill that out. Here's what we've got coming up next week. Mark McKelvey is going to be talking about what Agile teams need to know about AI. It's going to be interesting to hear what he's got to say. Maybe we can ask him some testing questions. Then the week after that, we're going to be talking about what is DevOps. We're going to get a review of what that means, what it looks like, and particularly what are the benefits that it can bring to a software project. Then Chris Lucian is going to be talking to us about generating organizational-wide understanding with cross-discipline causal loop diagramming. And the week after that, we're going to be looking at working software, the primary measure of progress. This was the one we tried to do, and there were some technical glitches here a month or two ago, so we'll be doing that one again. And then I think after that, we've got, I don't have his talk stuff, but in December, Matt Phillip is going to be coming in and doing a presentation. I don't know on what yet, but he and I are talking and working that out. Okay, so to get some more presentation feedback, okay, fill out the presentation feedback. Oh, I had music going as we do this, so let's give it just a few seconds while you fill that out. Finish whatever you can, and then we will give away our faucet. Okay, we'll give it about 10 more seconds. Okay, Curse of the Testing Pyramid competitive quiz. Win up to 1,000 points per answer. Remember, you're competing for a box of Count Chocula. It'll be very, very exciting. I may ship it from Amazon, and then I'll eat that with my kids. Okay, everybody ready? Got your trigger fingers ready? Here we go. Okay, what happened to Howard Carter's canary after the tomb was opened? What happened to Howard Carter's canary after the tomb was opened? It flew away, it died in the coal mine, it was scared to death, or it was swallowed by a serpent. What happened to Howard Carter's canary after the tomb was opened? You have 5 seconds remaining. 2, 1, and Yes, it was scared to death. It died because it was scared to death by the serpent. The serpent didn't eat it. They got away from it, but it still was so terrified it died. Okay, looks like Dustin, our person that doesn't think that the 90s was all that long ago, and I'm with you, Dustin. It doesn't seem that long ago to me either. SS, Caroline, guests, Chris, Jeff, guests, and Boz and Brian. Very good. Next question. What is one major difference in the way tests run now than the way they ran in the past? One difference in the way tests run now than the way they run in the past. And sorry for teasing you, Dustin. Okay, we have 6 seconds remaining. One major difference. Okay, good. One major difference in the way tests are run now than the way they're run in the past. And answer is the cloud and containers let you run more tests faster and in parallel. Screen recordings no longer make tests brittle. I haven't seen screen recordings that will let us do that in a way that's not brittle, where if you change something. If you've got a way of doing that, though, send it to me because I'd love to see it. But yes, there's ways to do things more tests, parallel and faster, and pay just for what we use now. That wasn't something that we could necessarily do a long time ago. Okay, Dustin retains his lead, followed by Chris, guest, Jeff, guest, Caroline, SS, guest, Natalia, and Brett. Next question. What was a key benefit of behavior-driven development? What was a key benefit of behavior-driven development from what we talked about in this talk? Was it better screen recording software, faster computers, tests written by developers? Testing is now taught in college. You don't have to refactor your tests, or tests don't fail very often. What is the key benefit of behavior-driven development? This one may be a little bit tricky. We'll see what we end up with. But the one that I mentioned was that tests are written by developers. So instead of waiting till the very end to be able to see and then have people rate for the test and waiting for all that feedback, the developers actually write the test as they're writing or at the beginning and get the code working against that. So they're able to benefit from it through the rest of the development cycle. One place that's can be very, very useful is if you've got multiple teams working on the same application and each team is writing their tests. If I write some tests and get some things working and the other team checks out code and makes a change and it doesn't do what they expect, they make a change that breaks something the other team is working on, that getting that feedback right away can make a huge impact in how long you spend trying to troubleshoot stuff. If you have to wait for multiple weeks until somebody else writes test and then they've got to figure out whether it's working right or not, you just don't get the benefits of the test over the point that it's most critical. Okay, Dustin retains his lead. Look at that. Followed by guest Jeff, Chris, guest Carolyn, LJ, SA, Brett, and Natalia. Next question. What is a key technique to make tests less brittle? Is it page objects, JUnit, cloud technologies, Kubernetes? We mentioned these briefly, but I think you remember. Page objects, JUnit, cloud technologies, or Kubernetes. A technique to make tests less brittle and making it easy to change. The example we gave here was a login page. 1 second and done. And yes, it is the page objects that make tests less brittle. Cloud technologies generally can be used to make tests run faster. Kubernetes can be a very good way to make. We didn't mention that, but there are some really cool things you can do with Kubernetes. JUnit is a testing framework, so that can be useful. But the big thing that we were mentioning was that the page objects can allow you to kind of separate the stuff you're testing. It's almost like giving an API for the way you want to interact with the UI. So if you need to change something in the UI, you only change it in one place instead of in thousands of tests that all know the CS selector for this particular item. So if you're not familiar with page objects and you're doing any type of UI testing, look it up because it will help you out, or reach out to me. I'm happy to point you in the right direction. Okay, Dustin's still in the lead with a nearly perfect score, followed by guest Chris, Caroline, LJ, Natalia, guest Jeff, Brett, and guest 399. Next question, BDD represents an improvement to test-driven development, a fundamentally different way of doing development, a curse brought on us from Tutankhamun's tomb, an alternative to test-driven development, a way to follow safe, or a drop-in replacement for HPALM. What does behavior-driven development represent? Time's up, and yes, 53%. It's a fundamentally different way of doing development. If we think of it as improved test-driven development, I've had people ask me, well, should we do behavior-driven development or test-driven development? And if you hear those types of conversations, if your team's talking in those terms, it probably is a good indication that they don't really understand what behavior-driven development is, because it's really a fundamentally different way of doing development and getting your requirements and what you're writing code against. Okay, that's still in the lead. What shape did Mark say tests should be? Did he say it should be square, dragon fruit, hexagon, ice cream cone, or don't worry about the shape, think about the value the tests provide? I'm trying to think of how you would get a dragon fruit shape test. But yeah, square, dragon fruit, hexagon, ice cream cone, or don't worry about the shape, think about the value the tests provide. 2 seconds remaining. And yes, don't worry about the shape. Think about the value the tests provide. If ice cream cone shapes tests give you confidence, makes it easy to change, you're getting good feedback and stuff, don't try to throw out a bunch of tests that you have that you're getting value from just to try to make it shaped a different way. And don't write a bunch of tests that you don't need and aren't providing value just to try to get more at the bottom level. Okay, there's leaderboard. Dustin's still in top spot, followed by guest Chris, Brett, Jeff, Caroline, LJ, Natalia, guest, and SA. I think we've got, okay, I think this is the last one. Which of these is not an upcoming Agile Lunch and Learn talk? So which of these is not an upcoming talk? There and Back Again, Returning to Safe After an Unlikely Adventure by Mr. Baggins. Oh, and I left a date in there. Okay, ignore that. What Agile teams need to know about artificial intelligence. What is DevOps, or generate org-wide understanding with causal loop diagramming? Which one of these is not a talk that's coming up? And yes, we are not going to be talking about There and Back Again, a Return to Safe After an Unlikely Adventure by Mr. Baggins. Oh, I think I threw a bunch of people off on this one, but the other 3 are talks that are coming up, so be watching for invites coming out for those. Okay, and so it looks like we've got 3 people made it, or our top 3 winners here. Justin's very motivated by cereal. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, we've got 3 winners here, and you guys are kind of close. So I'll tell you what, if the 3 of you want to send me a screenshot, or your name is fine, take a screenshot or just send me your name, tell me who you are. I will get the 3 of you. If you're in the U.S., I know I'll get you both or all Count Chocula. If you're outside the U.S., tell me where you are, and we will see what we can do. So anyway, thank you for coming and participating. Let's see. Oh, does this actually give me a... Oh, no, it doesn't do it. Okay. Let me go back just so if you need to give me a screenshot, you can. There we go. Okay. So go ahead and send me an email. Let me know, and I will make sure that we get your prizes headed your way. Thank you all for coming. I will stick around for a few minutes. If you had any questions you wanted to discuss, I'd love to talk to you about. But thank you all for coming, and hope to see you all next week. We're talking about what you need to know about AI if you're working in the Agile space.